Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz here in our Northwest Side studio.
And I'm Brandis Friedman reporting live in Chicago's Greater Grand Crossing community.
And on the show tonight,
our young people are incredibly resilient.
A pandemic, civil unrest, and increase in violence, how community organizations in Greater Grand Crossing are helping young people cope with adversity.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
The vice presidential debate, a more typical political affair last night, as President Trump says he will not debate Joe Biden virtually. Mayor Lightfoot announces a public-private partnership to create a strategic plan aimed at giving all young learners a chance to thrive. Visiting the Hall of Presidents at a Chicago theater institution and their new show about America's First Ladies. The winners of Chicago's Winter Dining Challenge have been announced. Hear their ideas. And Jeffrey Bayer on the history of landmarking in Chicago.
In Paris, as I mentioned, I am reporting in the Greater Grand Crossing community where I'll be co-anchoring for Chicago Tonight's next stop in our In Your Neighborhood series. It's a community area that is situated in between several others, so coming up later on, we'll talk a little bit about how it got its name, but we'll also talk about some of the mental health challenges that it's facing, along with so many other communities, but also what's being done to overcome them. All that is coming up a little bit later on, but of course, Paris, for now, we'll send it back to you.
All right, Brandis, we look forward to all of that. But first, tonight's top stories. Federal agents foil an alleged terrorist plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The FBI says a Michigan-based militia group plotted to abduct Whitmer, detonate explosive devices, and kill police officers. The criminal complaint says the group surveilled Whitmer's house and attempted to recruit others because they were upset at the governor's COVID restrictions on businesses and mask mandates in the state. 13 men in total were charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, which could carry a life sentence. Governor Whitmer laid some of the blame at the hands of President Donald Trump for rhetoric she says emboldening white supremacists. And today, Mayor Lightfoot echoed those same criticisms, talking about threats she says she's faced.
Donald Trump has emboldened and empowered an element in our country that we know exists. Sometimes we don't want to talk about it, but is absolutely there. And there's a lot of racist, misogynist, xenophobic, violent people that are out there who threaten me and my family and other elected officials because the president gives them license.
Meanwhile, state public health officials announced the largest new batch of coronavirus cases since May. More than 3,000 cases were recorded in the last 24 hours, including 32 additional confirmed deaths. The 7-day testing positivity rate has ticked up to 3.7%. A Chicago-based candidate for U.S. Senate announces he has COVID. Willie Wilson says he's tested positive and is experiencing mild symptoms. Wilson says he'll quarantine for 10 days and suspend his campaign for that time. He's running as an independent candidate against Democratic Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, among others. And the city announces more relief help for neighborhoods struggling with COVID-19. Mayor Lightfoot announced a new $25 million fund from the Chicago Community Trust that'll be used to boost employment, help small business, and spur economic development in primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods. The donations to the fund come from corporations like J.P. Morgan and Pepsi. And now we go to Phil Ponce and a look at a very pointed, but by comparison, subdued vice presidential debate. Phil.
Paris, after last week's contentious presidential debate, it's probably fair to say that last night's vice presidential debate was markedly more civil, and the audience tuned in. More than 50 million people watched the vice presidential debate last night compared to 35 million people, 35 million viewers, that is, in 2016. Here with their reaction to how effectively the candidates communicated their messages are Ed Lee, Senior Director of the Alvin W. Barkley Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue at Emory University in Atlanta, and Craig Shirley, a presidential historian and the visiting Reagan Scholar at Eureka College. He's the author of 10 books, including 4 on Ronald Reagan, and he's a political consultant who has participated in debate prep for candidates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Craig Shirley, I'll begin with you. As you know, the Debate Commission announced that next week's debate would be virtual. President Trump says he will not be taking part. Is that a smart move or is it not?
No, actually, frankly, I don't think it's a smart move at all by Donald Trump. It makes him look like he's running away from a confrontation from Joe Biden. Joe Biden wins in a TKO if Trump doesn't show up. Look, there's historical precedent for split screen debates. John Kennedy and Richard Nixon debated 4 times in 1960. The third debate was a split screen debate with Nixon in Los Angeles and John Kennedy in New York. And the technology worked just fine in 1960. And I'm sure technology has probably improved a little bit in the last 60 years. So there's no reason why he can't. There is something to be said for a person-to-person debate with the handshake and the eye gesture, with the eye.
Ed Lee, in terms of if you were advising the candidate Trump, what would you tell him?
If I was advising President Trump, I would agree with what Craig Shirley was suggesting, that for you not to show up is to really grant a victory, that there will be an event that will take place on that date. And it's a question of whether it will be an event that solely features Joe Biden talking for 90 minutes, or is it an opportunity to get your message out? And I ultimately think this is posturing, and we're going to have a debate.
Before we get into the substance of what was said last night, it must be said that in many quarters, what people are talking about, and it's gone viral, there are memes all over social media, is the fly. Is there a possibility, Craig Shirley, that people will only remember the fly?
I think it's very likely that people will only remember the fly. It's interesting that the little things that often mean a lot in presidential campaigns, little exchanges between Lloyd Benson and Dan Quayle, or little exchanges between Bob Dole and Walter Mondale in 1976. I guarantee you that Saturday Night Live is going to do a skit about it. And within a year, the only thing people are going to remember about this debate is, first of all, Kamala Harris did a very good job, and secondly, the fly.
Well, let's go to what happened right out of the gate. The first issue that was addressed was COVID. Let's watch.
Thank you, Vice President. The American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country. And here are the facts. 210,000 dead people in our country in just the last several months. Over 7 million people who have contracted this disease.
When I look at their plan that talks about advancing testing, creating new PPE, developing a vaccine, it looks a little bit like plagiarism, which is something Joe Biden knows a little bit about. And I think the American people know that this is a president who has put the health of America first, and the American people, I believe with my heart, can be proud of the sacrifices they have made. It's saved countless American lives.
Ed Lee, as you watch the debate, how would you assess the difference in style between Kamala Harris and the vice president?
Started talking about the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debate, and one of the things that the audience drew a difference from was they thought that Nixon did a poorer job based upon those who were watching it. Kennedy did a better job based upon those who were. And I think that the nonverbals play an important role. The visuals that you see at times play a more important role than the oral. I think that what you saw from Kamala Harris was the daft ability of some people to communicate very powerful messages with saying very little at times. And that will be one of the things that we will also remember. I think that Craig is right. We'll talk about the fly. But in some communities, like my sisters, they're talking about the nonverbals that Kamala Harris was getting off, and the ability for women to communicate in ways that are at sort of sub-levels that men at times are not very perceptive of. I was surprised by the inability of Mike Pence to sort of tune into that Midwestern folksiness that he has historically been able to draw upon and be a foil to Donald Trump, that in some ways he was ultimately just Trumpian light. That with the interruptions, with the sort of people that I don't think that he can ever get too angry as Mike Pence, but it did seem like she was able to get under his skin at times. And so those are from a stylistic perspective, the two things that sort of chimed in that I witnessed and saw with the two candidates.
On several occasions, Kamala Harris had to say specifically, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. Let's look.
Susan, this is important.
Susan,
I
I
want to
have
add,
to
but
weigh in
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
in. Repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well, wait,
I'm speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then
Please.
have a conversation, okay?
please.
Okay.
I would like to give Senator Harris a chance to respond, but not at such great length, because of course there are other topics we want to talk about.
But I would like equal time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Mr.
Yes,
Vice President, I'm
please,
speaking.
very
I'm
fast.
speaking. Okay.
Craig Shirley, both candidates had to deal with some unstated but very real optics. Pence as a white male and Harris as a black woman. How did they negotiate these optics?
I think they're just fine. You know, the race, I don't think was even a factor last night. You had two intelligent, capable people on different, with two different points of view, debating them and trying to communicate their message to their audience. I wouldn't say they were trying to reach out to people in the other party. That's not this type of election. This is a base election. Senator Harris is trying to reach the Democratic liberal base, and Pence made it very, very clear that he was a conservative and he was reaching out to a conservative Republican base. So I don't know what the visuals. I mean, I'm not an expert in that, but I think I just saw two intelligent people, and I would score it basically a draw, because they both achieved what they wanted to achieve, which was to arouse their own bases. And that's what this election is going to be.
Ed Lee, very quickly, were you aware of some optics that both of them had to negotiate, because she was a black woman and he was a white male, in terms of how it might have impacted their interaction or preparation for the debate?
Well, I've alluded to this earlier. I think that one of the demographics that both parties are ultimately trying to get more votes from are the white suburban female, and that there's a huge gender gap that exists. And I think that for those women, one of the things that they saw was the way in which they have to negotiate meetings in their staff rooms, the way in which they negotiate this in their homes and in their shops, and having someone cut them off and interrupt. And I think that that's a part of the conversation that at times men are not very perceptive of, because we don't have to deal with it all too often. And I think that Kamala Harris negotiating that and doing so in a masterful way, I would dare say, had helped her in some ways that some of us may not think about.
Gentlemen, that's where we'll have to leave it. Ed Shirley, Craig Shirley, that is, and Ed Lee, thank you both very much for your insights. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Paris, we go back to you.
Thanks, Phil. This week, Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced a new plan to invest $8 million in mental health services in communities across the city. One of those communities is Greater Grand Crossing on the south side, where neighbors say years of disinvestment collided to meet the pandemic and a recent increase in violence, creating a crush of mental health needs. Brandis Friedman and producer Marissa Nelson spent the day reporting in the Greater Grand Crossing community, and they come to us now from one of the three neighborhoods in that community, and that neighborhood is called Grand Crossing. Okay, I think I got that. Brandis, take it away.
I think I got it too, Paris. So right now we're at the Gary Comer Youth Center. It's at 72nd and South Chicago. It sits right next door to Gary Comer College Prep. It's a Noble Network charter school. Now, Greater Grand Crossing, I think I got it too. It's situated between a handful of other Southside communities, including Chatham, Inglewood, and South Shore. Now, the director here at Gary Comer Youth Center, her name's Ayoka Noel Samuels, she explains part of how the community got its name.
All of these streets that come through this neighborhood, that's why they call it Grand Crossing, you know? It's like you have South Chicago, you have Cottage Grove, you've got 71st Street, all of these streets that intersect. And that's because that's how we do it here. We intersect.
Now, this is a predominantly black neighborhood where 30% of the residents live below the federal poverty line. Parts of this community are struggling in the fight against COVID-19. The zip code where we're standing right now, for example, 60619, has an 8.2% 7-day positivity rate. compared to the city of Chicago's rate of 4.3%. But a neighboring zip code has a much lower positivity rate, and the others fall somewhere in between. Now, here at Gary Comer Youth Center, young people have access to after-school programming ranging from urban agriculture to computer technology classes, plus, of course, sports and arts. Center Director Samuels, who you just heard from, she says that so many young people learning virtually has her concerned.
To think about what needs to happen for middle school age and high school young people. They oftentimes are bored. And when they are bored and they're left to their own devices without caring adults around them, you can't really control what their response is going to be to everything that's going on right now.
Now, just down the street from Gary Comer is Ring of Hope, a nonprofit that provides boxing and double dutch as an after-school activity for young people. Its founder, Anthony Wright, also works as a social worker for Chicago Public Schools. But of course, that experience gets applied to his work at Ring of Hope. The community has already experienced its share of violence, but as is the case for so many Chicago communities, it's worsened this summer. At 35 homicides, its homicide rate is 35% higher than the same time last year. Shootings are up as well, 77% higher. Anthony Wright says that he sees the mental health issues in the work that he does in the community, including depression and domestic violence.
Just always been a problem in our community. I think there may be an uptick in violence, but I think that unfortunately a lot of people have kind of normalized it in an unfortunate way. A lot of people have moved, they've relocated. Our community has become more transient. You know, when I grew up, you knew who your neighbors were.
Another sign of the times, Ring of Hope also runs a food pantry that started 11 years ago. Now, just before the pandemic, pantry director says they served about 150 people a day, twice a week, in a community that is considered a food desert. Now they're serving about 350 people a day, giving away over 40,000 pounds of food through a partnership with the Greater Chicago Food Depository. Wright says part of why he lives and works here is because he is nostalgic about the Greater Grand Crossing that he knew when he was growing up here. He wants the young people who live here today to know that some of what they experience is not normal, and that level of trauma and disinvestment should not happen all the time. Of course, some of the businesses here were victims to the property damage that occurred over the summer. Some of them have made it back, and some of them have not. One that has been able to hang on through the pandemic and the reckoning is Five Loaves Bake Eatery. It's a breakfast and soul food restaurant. Restaurants everywhere are struggling, of course. A smaller one like this, being capped at 25% capacity indoors, means only about 6 customers compared to pre-pandemic when they used to have customers lined up outside their doors waiting to be served. Owners are hoping to resume plans that were put on the back burner when the pandemic set in.
Before COVID, we were hoping to kind of expand to the corner of our location right now so that we can have a bigger space. And now we want to start picking up those plans a little bit more and really just showing what it is that we're capable of doing, even despite all that COVID has kind of had those setbacks with.
Now, we talked a little bit about mental health. We're going to get into that a little bit more when we hear from Alderman Roderick Sawyer in just a few when we come back. Also, a mentoring organization that brings together young people, young black and brown people from various community areas in the area. But where else do they meet? But of course, Greater Grand Crossing. We're going to get into that a little bit more. But for now, Paris, we'll send it back to you.
Brandis, we look forward to that as we go back to you in Grand Crossing, in the Greater Grand Crossing area. I think we'll have that straight by the end of the show. And at the top of the show, we got feedback from debate experts about last night's matchup between Vice President Mike Pence and the Democratic nominee for the position, Senator Kamala Harris. But what about local community leaders who were less attuned to how the candidates got their message across, but about the policies they talked about? Amanda Vinicky spoke with stakeholders for their perspectives, and she joins us now. Amanda, what did you find out?
Well, Paris, it may not have been enough, and frankly, as a political reporter, I can't imagine that there is any such thing as enough, but the vice president candidates did get to some policy meat last night. For example, with health care, of course, COVID-19, but also the Affordable Care Act. Pence says Obamacare was a disaster. The Trump administration is trying to repeal the ACA. Harris warned those with pre-existing conditions or younger adults who are relying on their parents' insurance. She says they're coming for you of Trump. Now, as a VP with the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, Nadine Israel says she was disappointed but not surprised to hear Pence attack the ACA. But she wishes she would have heard more detail from both campaigns about their healthcare plans.
I think it's important. While the Affordable Care Act took a big chunk of the apple when thinking about increasing access to care and coverage, there are still millions of folks that don't have access to healthcare because of affordability issues and because of other issues where the holes that were left open in the Affordable Care Act. So we need to build on it, and we need to move towards a path towards universal coverage.
Well, Biden has talked about broadening government-backed insurance. He does not back a single-payer or Medicare for all system that is favored by some progressives. Now, president of the Illinois Manufacturers Association, Mark Denzler, says it is important to his members. He says 90% of them offer health care for their workers to be able to continue to offer that coverage.
There's a lot of concern about going to a government-run system. If you talk to employees today and you talk to the average person, they're very happy with their employer-provided health care. So we need to continue making sure that option's available.
Denzler's ears also perk up when the presidential candidates talk about environmental issues. When asked about climate change, Pence refused to say whether it's an existential threat. He says the country needs no Green New Deal. Harris accused him of ignoring science. And while Biden has said that he will not ban fracking, the Biden-Harris ticket's goal is to transition the country to zero net emissions by the year 2050.
Having goals about reducing carbon fuels, for example, or having zero carbon emissions by a certain date are certainly laudable goals. But if we don't have the technology, number one, and number two, you have to look at costs that you talked about. What is a manufacturer willing to pay for energy? What is the family at home struggling to survive today? You know, are they willing to pay 20 or 25 or 50% more in energy for some of those reduced emissions?
Hyde Park resident Mila Marshall says it is wrong to constantly pit the argument as the economy versus the environment. She says energy jobs, well, they may be great, but not when extraction of energy harms workers and harms the communities that are hosting those jobs, especially when those communities are those of color. She favors Biden's approach to the environment, but she says whoever wins this presidential contest, she says the next administration cannot continue the politics of environmental racism.
Corporations aren't people, but they should not have protection to cause harm to our air, land, and water, and woo us and seduce us with employment, receive tax credits, and then leave our air, land, and water, devastated for us to clean up while being sick.
Now, we were talking about the economy. Another part of that, of course, taxes. Economist Erica York of the Tax Foundation distills what we heard from Harris and Pence.
I think it's less clear from the debate last night what changes President Trump would make. We saw a defense of the tax cuts that he's already passed. We also, interestingly, saw a defense of the tariffs that he's implemented, which are actually a form of a tax increase. So we saw both sides of that on Trump's side. What we heard from Senator Kamala Harris was, again, a reiteration that Biden is only envisioning higher taxes on high-income earners and businesses.
And York gives a flag there for those who are on the wealthier scale, particularly if Biden were to win, and should Illinois' graduated income tax constitutional amendment pass, because Illinois does have a law in place that would increase taxes on those who are wealthy in Illinois as well. With that, back to you, Paris.
All right, Amanda, thank you very much. And be sure to visit our website for the WTTW News 2020 Voter Guide. There you'll find special coverage of the election and details on specific races. Plus, you can search for candidates by race or district and hear from them in their own words. It's all at WTTW.com/voter guide. And now we check back in with Brandis Friedman, who is co-anchoring tonight from the Grand Crossing neighborhood as part of Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood. Brandis.
Yeah, that's right, Paris. I look a little different now. Masks up, of course, because we're joined now by 6th Ward Alderman Roderick Sawyer. We should probably clarify that we are standing in just the one corner of the Greater Grand Crossing community that is technically not in the Alderman's ward, but much of the Greater Grand Crossing community actually is in his ward. And Alderman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
When we spoke with you back in April, we visited Chatham and we talked about the disproportionate impact that COVID is having on the Black community. Is that disproportionate impact still being felt on the Black community in this community?
I will say we're working on it. It is something that our businesses are trying to rebound. We've had some businesses that really suffered, but we had a few that experienced some tremendous growth. So it's a work in progress.
How would you say the community is doing with regard to testing and access to the care they need?
Overall, I think that the community is responding well. There's a lot of testing opportunities in the area. We just had one in our office last Friday, and we're constantly trying to continue to do testing and making sure that people know that it's important.
So this week, the mayor announced an $8 million investment grant from the city to 32 organizations in 15 priority zones identified as hotspots for violence, including Greater Grand Crossing, to expand mental health specifically. How can these mental health resources help to address the trauma that comes with experiencing violence?
I think this is going to be a tremendous investment in the community at large in Chicago, and especially here in Greater Grand Crossing. Trauma is something that we're all experiencing right now as we're holed up in our houses. You know, we're experiencing different feelings, and it's okay. But we have to make sure that we get the proper treatment and care to address this, and I think this is a good effort going forward.
What kind of work can we expect to see from these community organizations that are receiving the grant funding?
First of all, treatment is free. No matter if you have insurance or not, the treatment is free. There's going to be greater access to availability. People can come in and almost walk in and get this treatment. I just need people to take advantage of it. That's what's really important.
What can your office do to spread that word so that people are taking advantage and losing the stigma that comes with seeking mental health support?
We try to do social media campaigns. We put it on our websites. We try to have flyers in the office. We just want to make sure that enough people get access to this treatment, which is going to be great.
The reparations subcommittee on the city council, that was initially your idea,
yes.
And it's taken some changes before this most recent iteration of it. What's on the list? What are we expecting there?
I am proud to announce that we've have a chairman of the subcommittee with Stephanie Coleman in 16th Ward and a vice chair, Andre Vasquez. These two individuals understand how important this is. And particularly with Andre Vasquez, I got a little bit of flack by appointing a non-Black to a leadership position in reparations, but he gets it. He understands, and he makes sure that he knows it's the Black thing, and he's going to do what's proper and what's in the interest of the Black community.
Okay, 6th Ward Alderman Roderick Sawyer, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Paris, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk to another community organization about some of the work they do here in Greater Grand Crossing in a little bit, but for now, we'll send it back to you.
All right, Brandis, we'll look forward to that report in just a bit. But now, since 1988, a Chicago storefront theater has performed an ever-changing program of super short plays. Near presidential elections, they've done 2 to 5 minute plays about every U.S. president. This year, they're staging their interpretation of the lives of the First Ladies. Producer Mark Vitale met some of those First Ladies and the young theater makers who carry on the tradition of a troupe called the Neo-Futurists.
Girls, they wanna have fun. Oh, girls, they wanna have fun.
45 Plays for America's First Ladies is a chronological journey from Martha to Melania.
By and large, these are white, wealthy women or women who grow into wealth as their families take political status.
This play is about the First Ladies, a job that doesn't technically exist.
It highlights the humanity of all these women, like they were people who had full lives aside from these men.
My goal was to have as many kinds of people who were not present in the stories we were telling to be the ones telling the stories. So our cast consists of people of different ethnicities and races, people of different sexual orientations, people of different body sizes and types.
The neo-futurist approach leaps from history to comedy to tragedy.
She landed in a small, unsteady marriage and became the most famous woman in the world.
Their take on Eleanor Roosevelt was shot on location. Other plays are music videos or puppet shows. Still others will be performed live online for a limited time. With their home in Andersonville closed to the public, The ensemble keeps running by writing and performing virtual shows. The new managing director is a Chicago native who previously toured shows from Romania to Peru. That experience prepared him to pivot for a pandemic.
Socially distant Olympics, go!
What you learn on those tours is that you have to be nimble, you have to be willing to change, to adapt and try things and experiment. And that's a lot like Neo-Futurists, where our whole aesthetic is based on being DIY and nimble and creating in whatever space you're in.
Silva gave us a tour of the long-running Hall of Presidents exhibition, a show of artwork that depicts every president. The newest painting is really a portrait of Harriet Tubman with Donald Trump featured on her cell phone. From Pat Nixon to Mary Lincoln, 45 Plays for America's First Ladies considers the delicate balancing act of being First Lady. But ensemble members are not exactly method actors. Just being themselves is also part of their offbeat approach.
We're non-illusionary. We're always playing ourselves. I'll never be a rapping founding father on the stage. I'll always be Jorge, telling the story about Jorge.
Even when they are portraying a First Lady, and even as the Neo-Futurists expand their skill set beyond the walls of their theater.
We've become film editors. We've become set dressers, production designers, and with that, we have now also embraced as part of the company we're a digital media company on top of everything else.
The more types of performances we're creating, the more people that we'll be able to reach.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
The Neo-Futurists' 45 Plays for America's First Ladies premieres virtually tonight from their Chicago headquarters, and it includes ensemble work from their sister companies in New York and San Francisco. You can find out more on our website. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, creating an environment for all young children to thrive even before they go to kindergarten. It's warm out, but not for long, of course. Ideas for how restaurants can winterize outdoor eating when dining indoors isn't going to be much of an option. And Jeffrey Bayer on a landmark anniversary in this week's Ask Jeffrey. But first, some more of today's top stories. Some COVID-related mortgage assistance is coming to suburban Cook County. County Board President Tony Preckwinkle announced the launch of a $20 million fund to help suburban Cook County residents with mortgage troubles due to the COVID-19 crisis. The program is expected to help up to 3,000 homeowners with direct payments of $10,000 each. Now, this money comes as part of the Federal CARES Act. The Blackhawks are losing one of their key players from their 2013 and 2015 Stanley Cup runs. The team announces goalie Corey Crawford is leaving. Crawford has been with the team for 13 years, posting a record of 260 wins, 162 losses, and 53 ties with a .918 save percentage. Hawks general manager Stan Bowman says Crawford and the team could not agree to terms on a new contract, and he will now enter the free agent market. Meanwhile, state public health officials announced the largest new batch of coronavirus cases since May. More than 3,000 cases were recorded in the last 24 hours, including 32 additional confirmed deaths. The total caseload is more than 310,000, and the total deaths are nearing 9,000. The 7-day testing positivity rate is ticked up right now to 3.7%. Just 1 in 3 Black and only 1 in 5 Latino children in the city are considered ready for kindergarten. That's according to data compiled by the Illinois State Board of Education. Research shows that early child education and support can have a tremendous impact on a child's development and even future job prospects. Today, Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced a new public-private initiative in partnership with nonprofit Start Early, aimed at developing a strategic plan to ensure that all the city's children are given the chance to thrive. And joining us now with more is Diana Rauner, president of Start Early, formerly known as Ounce of Prevention Fund, and the former First Lady of Illinois. Diana Rauner, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
I just want to start with the basics. So this initiative rolled out by you and the mayor tomorrow, it's called Every Child Ready Chicago. Tell us what it entails.
Yes, Every Child Ready Chicago is a public-private partnership to build on years and years of great work in the city of Chicago to ensure that all children across the city enter kindergarten ready to learn. So it's about working together with the private sector and of course our city agencies to develop a strategic plan, a vision, and then to start to build the infrastructure that will ensure that all children are getting the support that they need to enter kindergarten ready to learn.
All right, so this is focused on taking care of children between birth and kindergarten, as you said. Tell us why this period is so crucial?
Well, Paris, it's actually even before birth. So we provide services in this city to pregnant teens and to young women before they are becoming mothers. And we found over years of research that that actually prepares them to be their children's first teacher and to do a better job of helping themselves and their children succeed in school. So we know that the first 5 years of life, and particularly those first few years of life, are a critical time for building attachment relationships, for building and laying down the foundation in the brain to be able to manage frustration, handle communication, to be able to inhibit and develop the executive functions, the social emotional skills, and of course the critical language skills that help children enter kindergarten as curious and as confident and independent learners.
And as we mentioned at the top, only 1 in 3 African-American children, only 1 in 5 Hispanic Latino children are ready for kindergarten with these skills that you mentioned, according to research by the Illinois State Board of Education. Tell us why that is and how to fix that.
Well, honestly, Paris, for many years we didn't have that data. We've only had it for the last 3 years. And it's really a report card on how we as a city and as a state are doing in ensuring that all children have access to equal opportunity when they get to kindergarten. We know from research that the achievement gap opens very early in life. You can measure it as early as 9 months. So by 3rd grade, we're way too late. What we know we need to do is help parents at every stage of their child's development support their children's learning with age-appropriate experiences, particularly now when they are full-time parents and remote teachers. And then, of course, we need to ensure that the settings where children find themselves, childcare settings, Head Start programs, pre-K settings, that those are high-quality and stimulating environments that are staffed by people who are well-trained and well-compensated. It's a lot of work. It's very important, but we as a city are already spending a lot of money on early childhood. We need to spend more, but we need to make sure that every dollar is spent well.
And you mentioned that you're going to come together, public-private, to come up with an inclusive plan here. How soon might we see programs, classes, and is the idea to have them available to every Chicago child, neonatal to kindergarten?
Well, that's certainly a goal and a vision. It will take some time to get there. We already have many great programs in the city that are run by agencies and public and private agencies across the city. What we want to do is make sure that all of them have access to high quality professional development, curricula, that all of them are able to share their data and learn from each other. So I think what we'll start with is a visioning process that will kick off next month that will allow us all to come together and hear from everyone's voices to ensure that this really is truly a community-led effort. And then, again, we hope that we'll start to build the supports and the research infrastructure that will let us all know how we can do better and continual quality improvement.
And it's no surprise, no secret to anybody that the city, the state, they're in really perilous fiscal times right now, given the economic slowdown in COVID. Is there a price tag to this, and how might it be funded?
Well, a lot of this is already part of the enormous amounts of funding that we have, both from the city, from the state, and from the federal government. Part of it is ensuring that all of that money is coordinated and spent well. Then, of course, we are grateful that we've been able to raise some private dollars to support this effort from organizations like the Crown Family Philanthropies, BMO Harris, the Chicago Community Trust, the Shriver family, Melody Hobson, George Lucas. We're very grateful to those donors, and it will take more public and private dollars to build the kind of infrastructure that we need for continuous quality. This is a long-term and very ambitious vision. The mayor has been, and her staff have been very forethinking in thinking they want this to outlast any administration and be a foundation for a long-term future. We know that this will take years to see fruition, but the thing about early childhood is if you plant the seed now, you get a nice strong oak in a couple of decades.
And that's why the organization used to be called Ounce of Prevention. I have to ask you in the few seconds we have left, we mentioned at the top you're the former First Lady. Any observations now that you've been back in private life for 2 years, observations that looking back at your time in Springfield?
No, I have to say, I don't envy anyone in public service right now. It's a very hard time. I've been focused, as you know, Paris, on early childhood education for over 25 years, and I continue to spend my time doing this, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. I'm very, very proud of the work that we've done at Start Early for now 4 decades.
All right, and our thanks to Diana Rauner. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paris.
And now we go back to Brandis Friedman in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood, where she spent the day reporting as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Brandis.
That's right. That's right, Paris. So right now I'm joined by Vondale Singleton. He's the founder of CHAMPS, and it is a male mentoring organization specifically for Black and brown young men on Chicago's South Side. Of course, it's headquartered right here in Greater Grand Crossing. Vondale, welcome to Chicago Tonight, and thanks for joining us. You founded CHAMPS because of the impact that mentoring had on you when you were growing up. How important would you say mentoring is, especially for young men, and especially for young men who come from communities that may be disinvested in?
Yeah, so I would say the impact, first of all, that mentorship had on my life is the reason why I do the work that I do here in the Greater Grand Crossing community. And I would say it's vitally important, especially now with everything that's happening in the world. And our framework is social-emotional learning. So we focus on mental health, calm classroom, breathing techniques, and just giving our young men an opportunity, a safe space to be able to talk about problems that they're dealing with.
How would you say the pandemic has affected the young men you work with?
Well, the pandemic has really taken its course because, you know, we have an epidemic of gun violence that we know traditionally has been a problem in our city. And so with the pandemic, exacerbated the same issues that we've already had. And so for us, this is where CHAMPS rise, right? So we had to step in and say, we've been mentoring in person Saturday, so now we got to go virtual. So we're going to mentor every Saturday virtually. And so we've been consistently mentoring young men virtually, and now we're back in this building, mentoring every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., providing in-person support.
Now, of course, all of this is happening amid this racial justice movement that we see happening all around us. How do you see that weighing on the young men you work with?
You know, some of our young men have expressed hopelessness, and the thing that we push against when we talk about CHAMPS, we talk about education, empowerment, and exposure. So our #1 goal is to let young men know it doesn't matter if you're black, you're white, you're rich, you're poor, you're born to win in every situation in life. So yes, it's happening, but here we are breachers, right, of these gaps to say, we're not going anywhere. We're going to amp up our support. We're going to provide opportunities again for you to have a safe space where we remove barriers and you have access to mentors on a consistent basis. So the issues that they're facing at home, directly and indirectly, it kind of goes away, you know, for those few hours that they're with us.
Now, earlier we spoke with Alderman Sawyer, and we've talked a bit about investing in mental health resources in communities that experience this disinvestment and this violence. How would you say, you know, why is that necessary, and how can that impact the work that you're already doing?
Yeah, mental health is extremely important. I actually have a background in counseling and understand the power of therapy, the power of being able to talk through internal issues, home issues, school issues, relationship issues. And so our emphasis has been the framework of social-emotional learning with mental health, with leadership development. And again, just exposing our young men to opportunities that they wouldn't likewise have with the program. So culturally relevant conversations on a constant basis.
Okay, Vondale Singleton, thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, Paris, I'll join you in just a few minutes to wrap up the show. For now, back to you.
All right, thanks, Brandis. Really important programs there. And up next, from cozy cabins to heated tables, ideas to make outdoor dining possible when winter hits Chicago. But first, to look at the immediate weather. Hopefully, no snow quite yet.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
Don't be fooled by the warm temps outside. Winter is coming, so how are restaurants planning to offer outdoor dining when eating indoors still isn't much of an option. The winners of Chicago's Winter Dining Challenge have some ideas, and they were announced today. And WTTW News reporter Patty Wetley joins us now with the details. All right, Patty, so what are these great, bold ideas the winners came up with?
Yeah, so they had more than 600 submissions. They chose 3 winners who each received $5,000, and those were one, the Cozy Cabin, which takes its cues from fishing huts. It's kind of the most self-contained of the 3 winners. Another one is called Block Party, and it's these modular cubes that can be grouped or stacked in various configurations. And then the last is this deceptively simple idea of a heated table with blankets that borrows from an existing Japanese tradition. They're all kind of range in how much air circulates. Some are more enclosed than others, but they all allow for ventilation given the situation. And they all incorporate heaters to some degree because we're going to need it.
I think we are going to need it, Patty. Okay, those are some innovative ideas. So along with that announcement, the city also has some financial aid for restaurants. Tell us about that.
Right, because obviously restaurants are going to have to spend some cash to winterize themselves. So they can apply for $5,000 grants from the city. There's a $500,000 pool for them to draw from collectively. There are some parameters for that, but the applications for that open on October 16th. And in the meantime, the partners in this competition, including the Illinois Restaurant Association, are going to be putting together some pilot programs so we can trial these ideas, see how well they work. And I don't know, maybe they're going to get Mr. Freeze to come in and replicate January for us to see how that's going to work.
I'm happy waiting until January actually comes to feel those temperatures. All right, thank you, Patty.
Thanks, Paris.
And you can read Patty's full story on our website, where you'll find links to the Winning Designs websites. It's all at WTTW.com/news. The Woodlawn home of Emmett Till received a preliminary landmark designation last month from the city of Chicago. It's one of the latest chapters in the battle to preserve Chicago's historic buildings, which officially began 50 years ago this month. Jeffrey Bayer is here to trace a half-century story that cost at least one preservationist his life in this week's Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, right off the bat, it looks like you have a little owie on your head that you have a bandage on. Do you want to just explain what happened there?
Yeah, I had a little sports injury this week. Nothing serious. I'm okay, but the bandage is probably going to be a little distracting, so we thought we'd get that out of the way right off the top.
Well, we're glad you're okay. It looks like the bandage blends in pretty well. All right, let's get to the question. It is, when did Chicago start landmarking buildings, and why does it truly save them from being torn down?
Right. So as you mentioned, the South Side home of Emmett Till received a preliminary landmark designation in September. Till, of course, was the Black Chicago teenager who tragically was tortured and murdered during a trip to Mississippi in 1955 when he was just 14. His death helped spark the civil rights movement. The preliminary landmark status protects the building from being torn down until next year, when the city council will decide on whether to make it permanent or not. Landmark status in Chicago usually protects from demolition the parts of a building visible from the public way, like the outside of the building, the facade, at least on the street side. Today, we take it for granted that many buildings with historic and aesthetic value are preserved as landmarks, but it's actually relatively a new practice here in Chicago. In fact, the first official Chicago landmarks were designated only 50 years ago next week. And those were the Glessner and Clark houses in what we now call the South Loop.
Jeffrey, you know, this always gets framed as a battle, the battle to landmark a building. Who would be opposed to this?
Well, right. Pretty much anybody would agree that historic preservation is of value, at least in the abstract. But when it comes to any one particular building, the owner of that building might think that it makes more financial sense to tear down the building and build something new, or they may just simply feel that landmarking is trampling on their rights. The problem comes when too many of these buildings are lost, especially buildings that just are feeling old before they start to feel historic. In the 1950s, several groups started worrying about the number of pioneering skyscrapers in the so-called Chicago School that were being torn down, and they started pushing the city to do something about it. In 1960, the city granted more than 30 buildings honorary landmark status, but that didn't really have any teeth. There was no legal authority to prevent the buildings from being torn down. And this was put to the test later that year in one of Chicago's first huge preservation fights. This was the battle to save the Garrick Theater in the Loop, which had received honorary status. The building, with its stunning auditorium and Chicago School exterior, was designed by Louis Sullivan and Dagmar Adler. The battle to save the building ultimately failed, but out of it emerged an unlikely hero, a photographer named Richard Nickel. Here he is in this photo protesting outside the Garrick Theater with his famous sign, "Do we dare squander Chicago's great architectural heritage?" For decades, Nickel fought to save Chicago's architectural treasures, especially the work of Louis Sullivan, and it cost him his life. Nickel was killed in 1972 when part of Sullivan's Chicago Stock Exchange building collapsed on top of him during demolition while he was inside scavenging ornament. 4 years before Nickel's tragic death, the city had, in fact, passed a new landmark ordinance that did have the legal power to protect buildings, but the stock exchange was not landmarked. Landmarks are today still officially designated by the Commission on Chicago Landmarks and ultimately by the City Council, and those bodies also have the power to undesignate a property so that it can be torn down, but actually that's pretty rare.
And such a tragic death, Richard Nickel, but he gave his life for such an amazing cause to the city of Chicago. You mentioned the Glessner and the Clark House in the South Loop. They were the first official landmarks, what was it, 1970?
That is correct, 50 years ago. Here's Glessner House, built in 1887. Architect Henry Hobson Richardson designed it for the family of a farm machinery magnate named John Glessner. The building, where actually I started my career as a tour guide in the 1980s, was a radical design compared to the neighboring Victorian-style mansions that lined Prairie Avenue, which was Chicago's swankiest street in those days. The Romanesque style fortress-like edifice opens up to a large inner courtyard that brings in light while maintaining privacy. And right next to the Glessner House is the Henry B. Clark House. This Greek Revival frontier house built in 1836 is the second oldest home still standing in Chicago.
There's been a lot of preservation battles since. Tell us about those.
Right. For decades, there's been constant tension between development interests and preservationists. We might remember in 2014, Bertrand Goldberg's brutalist-style Prentice Women's Hospital with its wacky oval windows was torn down after a lengthy preservation fight. It had no landmark protection. And then there's the Thompson Center in the Loop, which the state of Illinois wants to sell, preservationists want to save. Preservation battles are often portrayed this way as sort of the big evil corporation against community interests, but it's often a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. And a recent example that we've reported on Chicago Tonight is the proposed Pilsen Landmark District, which would preserve hundreds of Baroque and Italianate buildings in this majority Mexican-American community, originally built by Bohemian immigrants in the 19th century. Many current homeowners see the landmark proposal as a potential catalyst for gentrification. And they say that the increased costs with maintaining landmark properties would just force them to move.
All right, so Jeffrey, in the few seconds we have left, I'd be remiss to not ask you about this new special that WTTW has coming up about the Chicago fire. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, a whole different story here. Today is the 149th anniversary of the start of the Chicago fire, which burned for 2.5 days. So our new WTTW documentary tells the story of the Great Fire through the eyes of 3 Chicagoans, one of whom was a former slave named Joseph Hudlin. He proved to be one of the great heroes of the fire. Here's a clip.
Hudlin knew that the fire was headed toward his workplace, the Board of Trade. While others fled, Hudlin ran several blocks toward the blaze, arriving before the building was engulfed in flames. He opened the vaults and grabbed critical records.
This man had the presence of mind to really save the lifeblood of the Board of Trade in its operations. I mean, how do you manage accounts when you don't have records?
Hudlin escaped before the building collapsed.
Wow, Jeffrey, I bet you we're going to unearth some things that we never even knew about the fire. All right, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I hope everybody tunes in and also looks at the website.
All right, and the Great Chicago Fire, a Chicago Story special debuts tomorrow, Friday, October 9th at 8 p.m. on WTTW and anytime at WTTW.com. And don't forget that you can also visit our website for more details about Chicago landmarks. While you're there, don't forget to submit your own question to Jeffrey Bayer. And that is our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
That's right. And you can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And be sure to join us tomorrow night live at 7 for the Week in Review.
Now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and healthy, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, representing dozens of families in the crash of a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jet. Mr. Clifford has been named lead counsel in litigation in federal court in Chicago.